In 1775, the strongest empire on earth went to war with its own farmers. Britain had the finest navy in the world and an army that had beaten France. The colonists had no navy, no treasury, and an army that went home at harvest. Every serious observer in Europe expected the rebellion to collapse within a season. Honestly, for the first 2 years, it very nearly did exactly that. So how did the losing side end up founding the most powerful nation in history? The answer is far stranger than the version taught in most classrooms. This was never a united people rising up against a foreign occupier. It was a civil war fought between neighbors who spoke the same language. Roughly 1 in 5 colonists stayed loyal to the king right through the war. And the men who wrote that all men are created equal owned people themselves. This is the American Revolution as it actually happened. To understand the break, you have to understand how loosely Britain held on. For over a century, London mostly left the colonies to run themselves. Colonists elected their own assemblies, set their own taxes, and argued endlessly. Historians call this stretch of benign neglect a kind of accidental freedom. Then, in 1763, everything about that arrangement changed. Britain had just won a world war against France, and it had been ruinously expensive. The national debt had roughly doubled, and somebody had to pay it down. Wait, the government looked across the Atlantic and saw an obvious answer. The colonies were prospering, and they had been paying almost nothing for their defense. So, Parliament decided the Americans would finally start contributing their share. It seemed reasonable in London and felt like a betrayal 3,000 miles away. A century of being left alone had quietly taught the colonies to expect it. The first big shock arrived in 1765, printed on paper. The Stamp Act taxed newspapers, contracts, licenses, playing cards, even dice. It was not a huge sum, and that was never really the point. The point was that no colonist had voted for the men who imposed it. In fact, that single objection would become the slogan of a revolution. Colonists argued that only their own assemblies could tax them. Britain replied that Parliament represented every subject, whether they had voted or not. The colonists found that argument insulting, and they said so loudly. Merchants stopped importing British goods, and the boycott bit hard. Within a year, Parliament backed down and repealed the tax entirely. But it also passed a second act declaring it could tax them whenever it liked. The colonists celebrated the victory and mostly ignored the warning underneath it. By 1770, Boston had British soldiers stationed in its streets. Roughly 4,000 troops now lived among 16,000 civilians. Soldiers took part-time jobs in their off hours, undercutting local wages. Every tavern argument now had an occupying army sitting inside it. Get this, the spark was a wig maker's apprentice shouting about an unpaid bill. A crowd gathered, snowballs turned to stones, and a nervous sentry called for help. In the confusion, soldiers fired into the crowd and 5 men died. The killings were quickly renamed the Boston Massacre, and the name stuck. It was propaganda, and it was also, in a narrower sense, entirely true. The soldiers were tried for murder, and a colonial lawyer defended them. He won most of them an acquittal, and he later signed the Declaration of Independence. Even at its angriest, this was still an argument inside one political family. Most people think the Boston Tea Party was a protest against expensive tea. Actually, the tax made the tea cheaper than the smuggled Dutch leaf colonists were drinking. The objection was never the price, it was who had the right to set it. Accepting cheap tax tea meant accepting that Parliament could tax anything at all. So, on a December night, men painted as Mohawks boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. They dumped 90,000 pounds of tea into the water and broke nothing else. One participant famously swept the deck clean before he left the ship. Britain responded with what colonists immediately named the Intolerable Acts. The port was closed, the local government dissolved, and troops moved into private homes. Punishing Boston was meant to isolate it from the other 12 colonies. Instead, it convinced the other 12 that any of them could be next. Within a year, delegates from across the colonies were meeting in Philadelphia. In April 1775, British troops marched out of Boston at night. Their orders were to seize the colonial weapons stored at Concord. Riders went ahead of them through the night to wake every farm along the road. By dawn, 70 militiamen were waiting on the green at Lexington. Nobody knows who fired first, and both sides insisted it was not them. 8 colonists died on the green in a fight that lasted minutes. But the countryside was awake now, and the march to Concord went badly. Wait, the retreat back to Boston is the part most people never hear about. Militia lined the stone walls for 16 miles and fired into the column all day. Nearly 300 British soldiers were killed or wounded before they reached safety. A political argument had just become a shooting war, and neither side could stop it. Even after the shooting started, most colonists still wanted reconciliation. They sent the king a direct appeal, and he refused to even read it. Instead, he declared the colonies in open rebellion and hired German troops. Hiring foreign soldiers to fight British subjects shocked even sympathetic colonists. In fact, that single decision pushed thousands of moderates toward independence. A pamphlet called Common Sense sold 100,000 copies in 3 months. It argued in plain language that hereditary monarchy was simply an absurd idea. By July, delegates in Philadelphia had voted to break with Britain entirely. The document they signed was equal parts philosophy, grievance list, and treason. Every man who signed it was committing a capital crime against his own government. If the war had gone the other way, they would all have been hanged. The man given command of this new army had never led a large one before. His first year in command was very nearly a complete disaster. He lost New York, he lost Philadelphia, and he lost most of his soldiers. Enlistments ran out every December, and men simply walked home for the winter. Honestly, his real achievement was not winning battles but keeping an army alive. He understood something his opponents did not about how this war would end. Britain had to conquer the colonies, but he only had to avoid losing his army. So he retreated and retreated and refused to be drawn into a decisive battle. Then on Christmas night, he crossed an icy river and attacked the sleeping garrison. The victory was small militarily and enormous for morale across the colonies. Enlistments were renewed, and the army survived to fight another year. In 1777, Britain devised a plan to end the war in one stroke. 3 armies would converge on the Hudson Valley and cut the colonies in 2. On paper, it was elegant, and in practice, the wilderness swallowed it whole. One army never left New York, and another turned toward Philadelphia instead. So, the Northern Army marched on alone, deeper into hostile country every day. Local militia felled trees across the roads and picked off supply parties. Here's what's fascinating. Ordinary farmers were bleeding a professional army dry. Now, by autumn, the British army was surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of food. Its commander surrendered nearly 6,000 men in a single afternoon. It was the first time a British army had ever surrendered to the colonists. And in a palace across the ocean, France had been waiting for exactly this. Saratoga convinced France to openly join the war against its old enemy. Suddenly, a colonial rebellion became a global war between 2 great powers. France sent money, weapons, ships, and eventually thousands of trained soldiers. Spain and the Dutch soon piled in, and Britain found itself fighting almost alone. Now Britain had to defend its colonies everywhere at once, not just in America. The American War was now just one front in a struggle spanning 3 continents. A French fleet in American waters would soon matter more than any land battle. Britain's greatest advantage, its unbeatable navy, was suddenly stretched thin. Honestly, the colonists had turned a local quarrel into Britain's worst nightmare. What began over a tax on tea now threatened Britain's empire around the world. The version most people picture is neat lines of soldiers firing in the open. But much of the real war was brutal, close, and fought between neighbors. In the South, the fighting collapsed into a savage civil war of ambush and revenge. Loyalist and patriot militias burned each other's farms and settled old scores. Wait, enslaved people were fighting on both sides for their own freedom. Britain offered freedom to any who would flee their rebel masters and fight. Tens of thousands seized that chance, and the new nation would not honor it. Native nations, too, were forced to gamble on which side threatened them less. Most allied with Britain, hoping to slow the colonists' hunger for their land. For them, no outcome of this war was ever going to be a victory. This was a far messier and more human war than the tidy paintings suggest. Through all of this, the colonial army's core strategy stayed the same. Avoid a decisive defeat, keep the army intact, and let time do the work. The hardest test of that strategy was a brutal winter at a place called Valley Forge. Thousands died of cold, hunger, and disease without a single shot being fired. Honestly, the army that limped into that camp barely resembled an army at all. But a foreign officer arrived and drilled them relentlessly through the snow. By spring, the ragged survivors marched and maneuvered like real professionals. The winter that should have destroyed the army had quietly forged it instead. That quiet, stubborn endurance mattered more than any single battlefield victory. An army that simply refused to be destroyed was slowly becoming unbeatable. By 1781, the war had dragged on for 6 exhausting years. A large British army had marched south and dug in beside a Virginia river. Its commander felt safe there, with the sea at his back for resupply and escape. The sea, he assumed, would always belong to the Royal Navy. Get this. The American and French armies were already marching hundreds of miles to trap him. At the same moment, a French fleet was sailing hard for the same river mouth. When the British Navy finally arrived, the French fleet was already waiting. The 2 fleets fought, and for once the British were forced to withdraw. With the Navy gone, the British army by the river was completely cut off. No escape by sea, no rescue by land, and enemy cannon closing in every night. The most powerful army in the region was now caught in an inescapable trap. After weeks of bombardment, the trapped British commander asked for terms. On an October morning, his army marched out to lay down its weapons. Nearly 8,000 British and German troops surrendered in a single day. A story spread that a British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." The most powerful empire on earth had just lost to its own farmers. Honestly, when the news reached London, the Prime Minister took it like a cannonball. Yorktown did not end the fighting overnight, but it broke Britain's will to continue. The formal peace treaty took 2 more years and was negotiated in distant Paris. Britain recognized American independence and handed over a vast western territory. The 13 small colonies had become a country stretching to the Mississippi. Against every reasonable expectation, the rebellion had actually won. Winning independence was, in a strange way, the easier part of the story. Now, the new nation had to actually govern itself, and it nearly fell apart. Its first system of government was so weak it could barely raise money or an army. So the leaders met again and argued a stronger constitution into existence. Here's what's fascinating. they built in ways to change it, expecting to be wrong. The grand promise that all men are equal did not include most people. It excluded the enslaved, it excluded women, and it excluded the poor. But the words themselves became a weapon future generations would use. Every later movement for rights would quote the revolution back at itself. The revolution did not finish in 1783, and in truth, it still has not. So why does a war between farmers and an empire still matter today? Because it was the first time a colony had successfully broken from a European empire. In fact, its example inspired revolutions across France, Latin America, and beyond. The idea that ordinary people could choose their own government spread everywhere. But the revolution also left contradictions that would haunt the nation for centuries. A country founded on liberty had written human bondage into its very laws. That unfinished argument between the promise and the practice is still ours. Every generation since has had to decide what those founding words really mean. The American Revolution was never a finished monument, but an argument still running. And understanding how it truly happened is how we get to finish it well.